It was as the simultaneous incarnation of the revolution and expression of the Enlightenment that Napoleon set about to achieve the domination and unification of Europe. By 1809, under his brilliant military leadership, his armies crushed all opposition in Western and Central Europe, enabling him to redraw the map of the continent as a geopolitical design. He annexed key territories to France and established satellite republics in others, many of them governed by relatives or French marshals. A uniform legal code was established throughout Europe. Thousands of instructions on matters economic and social were issued. Would Napoleon become the unifier of a continent divided since the fall of Rome? Two obstacles remained: England and Russia. England, in command of the seas after Nelson's crushing victory at Trafalgar in 1805, was for the moment invulnerable, but not strong enough to launch a significant invasion across the English Channel, as it would a century and a half later. England stood alone in Western Europe, aware that a peace with the conqueror would make it possible for a single power to organize the resources of the entire continent and sooner or later overcome its rule of the oceans. England waited behind the Channel for Napoleon and a century and a half later for Hitler to make a mistake that would enable it to reappear on the continent militarily as a defender of the balance of power. In World War II, Britain was also waiting for the United States to enter the lists. Napoleon had grown up under the 18th century dynastic system and, in a strange way, accepted its legitimacy. In it, as a Corsican of minor standing even in his hometown, he was illegitimate by definition, which meant that, at least in his own mind, the legitimacy of his rule depended on the permanence and indeed the extent of his conquests. Whenever there remained a ruler independent of his will, Napoleon felt obliged to pursue him. Incapable of restraint by concept, temperament, or experience, he launched his forces into Spain and Russia, neither of them essential to a geopolitical design. Napoleon could not live in an international order. His ambition required an empire over at least the length and breadth of Europe, and for that his power fell just barely too short. With the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, the age of total war, the mobilization of a nation's entire resources, had arrived. The scale of bloodshed and devastation harked back to the 30 Years' War. Napoleon's Grande Armée, now manned through conscription, including even in annexed territories, supplied and maintained itself on the assets of the conquered enemy and population, including gigantic financial tributes. The results were an enormous increase in the size of the army and the subjection of entire regions. Not until Napoleon succumbed to the temptation to enter territories where local resources were insufficient for the support of a huge army, Spain and Russia, would he face defeat? First, by overreaching himself, above all in Russia, in 1812, and then as the rest of Europe united against him in a belated vindication of Westphalian principles. At the Battle of the Nations in Leipzig in 1813, the joint armies of the surviving European states inflicted Napoleon's first major and ultimately decisive defeat in a battle. The defeat in Russia was by attrition. After the Battle of the Nations, Napoleon refused settlements that would have enabled him to keep some of his conquests. He feared that any formal acceptance of limits would destroy his only claim to legitimacy. In this way, he was overthrown, as much by his own insecurity as by Westphalian principles. Europe's strongest conqueror since Charlemagne was defeated, not only by an international order that rose up against him, but by himself. The Napoleonic period marked the apotheosis of the Enlightenment. Inspired by the examples of Greece and Rome, its thinkers had equated enlightenment with the power of reason, which implied a diffusion of authority from the church to secular elites. Now these aspirations had been distilled further and concentrated on one leader as the expression of global power. An illustration of Napoleon's impact occurred on October 13, 1806, one day before the Battle of Jena, where the Prussian army was decisively defeated. As Napoleon left to reconnoiter the battlefield with his general staff, the then university lecturer Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who would later write the philosophy of history which inspired Marx's doctrine, heard the clatter of horses' hooves on the cobblestones and described the scene in panegyrical terms. I saw the emperor, this world soul, riding out of the city on reconnaissance. It is indeed a wonderful sensation to see such an individual who, concentrated here at a single point, astride a horse, reaches out over the world and masters it.